Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the first video in a series, probably quite a long series, following just a complete progression of a painting. So I thought this might be quite interesting as a shift or a change from the kind of focused, quite specific exercise-based lessons that I have been doing, or demonstrating specific concepts. So this is a series of videos that will kind of just show one approach to producing a painting. So it's not the approach I always use when painting. I have different approaches for different subjects, so I'd probably work with a portrait differently, or a landscape, different types of landscapes, or paint in different ways. And so today I'm going to be doing a still life, and I'm going to be working from a reference. I don't always work from references, sometimes I work from life as well. And the approach I'm going to use is also among a bunch of different approaches, so I don't want this to seem like the kind of definitive way to produce a painting, but it is one approach, and it's quite a nice loose approach what I'm going to be doing in this series. So I'll get started with it. I'm going to be working straight on a white panel rather than using a toned canvas. Sometimes you'll see me use a toned canvas, but for this one I'm going to be using white. Part of the reason for that is you get quite nice texture if you kind of work thinly over a white panel or a white canvas rather than a toned canvas. It can make judging your values quite difficult, so it's probably trickier than working on a toned canvas. Generally for beginners I recommend working on a tone, but you can produce some quite nice textures or create textures that kind of glow and work well underneath the final painting. The pre-Raphaelites mostly worked on white panels, so if you ever get a chance to see any of their paintings in the flesh, you can see the white showing through, and in unfinished parts of the paintings it's just a pure white canvas, and it did give their paintings a certain effect. As I say, I'm going to be working from a reference, so you can see I've kind of got my iPad set up next to my canvas here. I do have a very slight grid, so you can probably see if I zoom in just there. I have basically divided it into quadrants, so I've got 4 different quarters that I'll be kind of using to help me with my initial drawing. But it's not very heavily gridded, so I'm still going to mostly just be drawing from eye. And I'll possibly use some kind of, if necessary, I can do some comparative measurements on the screen. It's quite a nice setup, this. I use it quite a lot for painting if I have a subject that I can't keep, or if the lighting is, say, complex. This was actually a sunlit photo, and direct sunlight obviously will shift quite a lot if you're working in it, so it's a bit easier to work from a photograph. And it is nice being able to kind of zoom in and out. You can kind of see detail as you start to, if I start to work kind of larger in the painting, you can kind of zoom in almost to a point where it matches the size of your panel, which is quite useful, obviously depending on the resolution of the image. And you can zoom back out to get a different effect. So it is quite a good way to work. I generally, as you're kind of starting out, I don't recommend overdoing it with photographs. I do think it's really important to work a lot from life when you're working representationally, just because there are nuances that you just don't get in photographs, and there are also things that a photograph does to visual perception that is kind of less effective than what a painter can actually do. So in other lessons I talk a bit about, or I'm not sure if I've done it yet, but I'll be talking a bit about how halftones change chroma. And in photographs, halftones actually increase in chroma, so it's the more that you paint and you work from life, and you look at paintings that have been made from photos versus paintings that have been made from life, you do see the difference, and it does become obvious that someone's worked from a photo rather than from life. So I do a mixture of the two, and initially I'd emphasise working from life mostly, just because it'll give you a good understanding of how things actually looked to the human eye compared to a camera. So when you are then working from a photograph, you can kind of compensate for some of the things that photographs do to an image, how they distort colour and shape. It's also worth bearing in mind when you think about your vision, you have 2 eyes mostly, most people have two eyes, but when you look at things with two eyes, you basically create a three-dimensional image in your head. And a camera, obviously, most cameras, with the exception of 3D cameras, just use a single lens. And that's kind of like looking at everything with one eye closed. So it just makes for a slightly different kind of effect of how you perceive form. And that's kind of important as well in terms of producing art. I mean, you will find it's useful to kind of close one eye and use both eyes when you're working. It can kind of simplify shapes if you close one eye and always use that single eye. But in terms of kind of getting a general sense of form, it can be useful to use both eyes and create that kind of sense of voluminousness. So I'll stop rambling now and start working. I probably won't actually talk, once I actually get going, I won't talk quite as much as normal in this lesson because it's going to mostly be a demo. I'm going to also try to make a few time lapses. Once I've kind of explained the basics of it, I'll shift into time lapses just to kind of show the progression of the painting without you having to sit through hours and hours of it. And today what I'm going to be looking at is producing a very simple kind of wash drawing, initially in raw umber, to kind of create all the main shapes quite lightly. But I'm not actually going to shade everything in too dark or paint everything in too dark. As I say, what I want to do is mostly use the actual colour that I'm going to end up with in my final piece directly washed over the white initially, and then build that into a more rendered piece. But I'm going to try to avoid overdoing it with my raw umber today, or in this initial lesson. This is going to mostly be for plotting basically the outside of the skull, shapes of the magnolia, and there's this small fragment of a little face there. If you've not seen my personal work, this will probably seem quite weird, but if you've seen my website or my Instagram or something like that, you'll probably not find it so strange that this is what I work from. But I thought it'd be interesting to actually follow me working on a piece in my kind of professional practice, and see how I kind of apply all the different things that I teach. So I'll get started. As I say, what I'm going to begin with is a pretty kind of general construct, some simple lines. I won't be filling in any masses just yet. I think I'm going to limit myself to these two brushes, so I've got one probably in shadow right now, but one quite thin kind of semi-bristled brush. This one's it's from Rosemary & Co, and it's an ebony, which is one of my favourite brushes from Rosemary & Co, and this is also Rosemary & Co, and it's just one of their kind of basic brushes. I mostly use it for gessoing and varnishing and that sort of thing, but it's quite good early on in a painting if you're doing washes, if there's any sections I want to lay down any kind of tone or colour into. But yeah, I'll get started. So I've got my brush, I've got a little pot of mineral spirits, and to begin with just some raw umber. So I'll get started. Just put my other brush up there. So I'm just going to mix a pretty thin amount of raw umber. I'm also going to get some tissue paper in case I need to wipe anything back. And to begin with, I am just going to quickly note in my halfway point. Try not to destroy my iPad. Might actually find this a bit more accurate if I use a ruler. I know that my panel's 16 inches, so So very lightly sketched in that grid I was talking about. In the wrong picture. So using that, I can now start to kind of approximate how wide the skull is. So I'll start with the skull, seeing as it's about a third that comes across. It's the main kind of main form in the image. So what I've done there is just mark a general line, which I'll slightly rub out because it's not gonna remain. But what that's given me is an approximate kind of overall width for that skull. To be a bit more accurate, it's probably a bit lower down because the kind of furthest left point of the skull is just this bit of the top of the jaw that juts out, top of the mouth that juts out. And I can now kind of have a look at approximately where I think it ends, so we'll say about here, something like that. If I zoom in a bit, I can kind of see that. Looking at a sort of comparison, I would say that the top of the skull jumps up about the same distance that cuts in. So if that's about, let's say, an inch. Just have a quick look at this because it seems it's a little bit out, that mark I have on the right. It's more accurate. So the top of the skull cuts in maybe about that much, and it occurs about that point there. And then it kind of doubles back, crosses this line, end up with this kind of little triangle. Then it comes back to about here. Then you have this kind of a pretty ghosty line going down to the front portion of the skull. Try to figure out about where this bridge of the cheek comes across. Looks to me about a third. Yep, a third, which is actually the same distance as the jaw juts out. So you'll notice I'm generally trying to keep my brushwork pretty loose, and I'm doing that by, as far as possible, holding the brush right back at the end. It just kind of forces you to do these longer strokes. Otherwise, if I was holding it right up here, I'm going to start doing kind of drawing a bit too early, and I don't want to do that if I can avoid it. So holding the brush in this kind of way keeps everything quite sketchy right in the beginning. So I'm also just going to keep lightly scrubbing back. I want to keep this drawing really light, so I don't want it to end up too kind of overemphasized. I'm trying not to actually put a great deal of paint on the brush. Once it runs out, I don't add any more, which means that any marks I do, I have to just kind of sketch over the top for a long time for them to work. And if I really need to remove something, I can dip it in terps and then scrub it out like that, and you pretty much lose it straight away. So it's really just a light sketch underneath. It's useful because it's kind of non-invasive to the subsequent layers. It's not going to interfere too much. Raw umber is quite a good neutral to use from that point of view. So, I'll get back to the drawing. What was up to? Just going to re-emphasize the bottom, these teeth down here, so I know exactly where they're going. To put the skull there. This edge. And the back of the skull. So if I carry on, I can start to try and find the general kind of sweeps of the skull, because it's kind of leaning towards us, or towards the viewer. So the brow crosses this central line at approximately this point here, and it stops about there. I'm just going to start adding in some of these aspects a bit more accurately. So you can see I'm just starting to make some sense of the front of this skull. It's a fairly delicate job because the it's kind of pretty exaggerated. Fairly exaggerated sort of combination of foreshortening and a tilt, which makes for a fairly complex array of shapes, but it roughly seems to be getting there, which is good. So as I say, I'm going to try to resist the temptation, or as I said earlier, try to resist the temptation to add too much tone, but the tone is helping me to make some sense of these shapes as I work. But I might go back and just try to soften some of this out. Or lighten it at least, maybe not soften. That's the wrong word. Yeah, that seems kind of flicking my eye back and forwards. Not a bad approximate shape. So to avoid sort of belabouring this part of the painting, I'm going to try to move on fairly quickly. I might just readjust this nose. Actually add in a little bit of an accent to it, because I'm fairly confident the nose will actually be quite close to this pure ombre once it's actually in. And it also just gives me a little bit of a specific point to latch onto in the painting. I know that's pretty dark, that section anyway. So what happens, it loops down. This portion sort of juts out. Yeah, it's not doing too badly. It's capturing everything I need it to. I can jump back to the back of the skull now. Just add in a little bit of soft shading to the back of it. Now, I know that this section under here is actually going to be, well, pretty much all of the section under the skull is going to be pretty dark, so I don't have to be quite as restrained when I'm re-emphasizing it. actually going to swap to this larger brush to block in this shadowy section, just because it's a lot faster. So I can now just do the same. Backside of the skull, and the portion at the top of it that meets this dark section of bird's nest is what it actually is, kind of over there. So for the time being I'll leave all of this yet to be described. I'm just blocking the bottom of the box the skull's sitting out of. One of the kind of main aspects of this image that I'm focusing on is there's this kind of projection of the skull over the edge of the box. Which will create quite a nice illusion, kind of almost as though the skull's coming out of the painting is what I'll be going for with that aspect. So the final thing, the skull, that I need to establish is what's going on in this section here around the temple. Just using that brush to portion of tone. And that's pretty much, as far as drawing goes, that's about what we need for the skull for the time being. The rest of it will be added in with colour. So this initial part of the painting is basically to just kind of as quickly as possible get enough information onto the image that you can kind of start working on coloured washes over the top. So we don't want to overdo this at all. Want to keep it kind of simple. You want the white showing through, as I say, because it's important that we still have the white to work on as we glaze over. But anything that is going to be black anyway, you can actually re-emphasize, so I'm just doing that with my large brush. Here. That pretty much does it for this portion of the drawing, which means I'm going to subsequently go through and do the same thing with the flowers and this little fragment of face. So basically just outlining the fragment of face. What it sits in is just a bunch of sticks, so that'll be, subsequently I'll be working on that. It's kind of more abstract, so I can just kind of wash over. But we'll get back into that specifically once we move into the next stage, which would be kind of adding colour over our kind of very light wash drawing. So the rest of this video is just going to be a time lapse as I add everything else in, so you guys can kind of see the same process. I mean, I'm not going to be doing anything different. I'm going to be using the same kind of measurement approach, trying to get the same level of detail in, and then I'll jump back in. The next lesson after this is going to be about kind of washing over with colour and trying to get a reasonable finish, actually, just by using direct painting method, but directly painting quite thinly. And then third and fourth lessons will be kind of refining, going back and refining into that. But that's it for today. Or, well, there'll be a bit more to follow this talking part of the video. But that's it for the kind of explanation aspect of this this video, so I hope you enjoyed the time lapse. And I'll see you guys for the next one, which will be next week. Thanks a lot.